I titled this Why, How, and When. So why do we want to grow seedlings rather than direct seed? Well, first off, jumpstart on the season. Secondly, direct seeding can be unpredictable. 3, expensive seeds. 4, seeds need some seeds need special conditions to grow. And then 5, sometimes the conditions in the field are not optimal. And the 6th is we're going to save some time. So these are reasons why we might transplant. This is an obvious example of getting an early start on the season. You know, we can grow much bigger tomato plants in the greenhouse right now than we can out in the open. And that translates into earliness in our tomato crop. So some things it just pays to start inside because they're going to be fruiting sooner. This one is an example of seeding, and I titled this, You May Not Know What Your Results may vary. So Ruben's helping me seed here, and Ruben's a great help, but the truth is sometimes with seeding you just don't quite know what you're going to get, and so by transplanting we get a more of a sure thing. And I apologize, I realize that video probably looked really spotty for you guys, but nothing really fancy there. We're just seeding some carrots in a couple beds. The point is that when you're using a seeder like this, it's less predictable than it is to drop a seed into a cell in a on a seedling table or in a germination chamber and watch that seed grow, and then you know you have a plant. Now sometimes we're growing things like this where it's baby greens and they're sown really close together. It would be very difficult for us to do seeding on seedlings on that. Not impossible. With paper potter we have done some crops like this, but the downside of this is these are really close together, which means they're probably going to crowd each other. These are actually baby spinach, and so as they mature they're going to crowd each other somewhat, and that's going to be a problem. So so we like it when we can transplant things, partly because we can space them out a little better. Expensive seeds. Here's an example of expensive seeds. So this is one of the seeds we grow. It's oh, I cut off the label, I guess, but it says Socrates cucumbers. 100 seeds of Socrates are $65, so 65 cents a seed. I am not going to stick those seeds out in the field. That would be crazy. So we soil block these and then we transplant them out because we want to make sure that we take the very best care of that 65-cent seed that we can. And then, of course, it allows us to really control our spacing. That's one of the things I love about growing seedlings. It allows us to do things with varieties that we wouldn't do when we were seeding in the field probably. So like, you know, here you can see some reds transitioning some green head lettuces both in the same beds. Over here you can see some green and the red stripe and so on. Well, I wouldn't do this if I were running a seeder. I would run, I'd run one row down and I'd run one row back, and then maybe I would switch for this third row, but usually not. So transplanting is one way to sort of be able to diversify things a little, in some ways more simply. One thing I love about transplanting is, and growing seedlings as opposed to direct seeding, is it gives us a little more time. And in this case, we're using this time to do weed control. So by tarping here instead of direct seeding something, we're getting some weed control here, while in the greenhouse, we've got our plants growing. Another reason we mentioned is that some plants have really specific conditions that they need to grow under. And some seeds, I mean to say. Let's see, to get to this list. I think I got things out of order here a little bit. Nope, I don't know where it went. Well, it'll probably pop up later. Anyway, there's a slide here saying there are some seeds that just are really particular. These flowers are just kind of representative, but for example, the status, a lot of our status starts pretty earlier than we could really direct seed it out in the field, and then we're going to transplant it out. But it needs, you know, if we had it in the field, it would be too cold. Bring it inside, it gets a little warmer and sprouts. I don't see any larkspur is one example of something that needs to be stratified. That means it needs a long, cool, moist period, and so you can do that by planting it out in the field. But then, if we're paying for seeds and we're got to maintain weed control over that space and those kinds of things for a long period, then sometimes it makes more sense to do that in a controlled setting like the greenhouse. So there's another example of reason we would grow seedlings rather than we grow transplants rather than seeding out into the field.
Oh, Curtis, we have a question.
And again, this diversity, to me, diversity moves us in the direction of transplanting, because this is what I want to take to market. I want to take about 25 heads of each type of lettuce, because that really creates a showstopper. People are going to come in, they're going to buy ahead of this and ahead of that, and that's going to be good for business and good for their diverse eating habits. If I were direct seeding, I would be very disinclined to do this, because it just doesn't make much sense to swap out your seeder every couple of rows. It's a lot easier to do this in a greenhouse setting where you're standing at the table with the packets of seed in front of you. You can just pull from a different packet and drop those seeds into transplant blocks or things like that.
Curtis, we have a question.
And then, yeah, sometimes the conditions for direct seeding are not optimal. This is obviously a pretty extreme condition, but this sort of thing happens. And this is in the Chinese greenhouse, which hopefully you don't get floods like this in your fields. But
Curtis, are you there?
Let's see. I understand that Patrick is trying to talk to me, but I can't hear him.
Yeah, if you don't mind, check chat real quick.
Yep. Maybe. Oh, okay, here we go.
Can you hear me now?
Still cannot hear Patrick. Sarah is translating for you, Patrick. Somehow she's getting you on the phone. So you're coming through the thing, but somehow I'm not hearing you.
Okay, well, we have a question in the chat.
And about tarps. There
yes.
we go. Okay, so the tarp question. Tarps are real variable in their timing and results. So how long do you have to leave tarps on to kill weeds? It depends on the season. It depends on the weeds. So this time of year, we can do a pretty quick kill of this season's weeds, meaning the cool season weeds. We can get those killed out in usually about 10 to 14 days. This is around 2 weeks, 3 weeks if you want to be a little safer. And so that's like chickweed, henbit, some of the grasses, but the thing that'll happen is when we pull that tarp off, we may have a clean soil, but as this soil temperatures are changing, it's triggering new weeds to germinate. So now we'll have things like amaranth, red root pigweed coming up. Things like that are really frustrating because they wait for the soil temperatures to be right before they'll come up. So it's really hard to kill them with a tarp unless you're going to tarp long enough to let the soil temperatures change, or you're going to tarp a couple times in the season. So it's a complicated answer. The other thing on the tarps is that temperature matters in terms of how quickly things react. So when it's cold and plants are really not trying, they're just kind of in a stasis. They're not trying to photosynthesize. They just don't get cold. They don't die very quickly either. So they don't grow very quickly, but they're not dying quickly. And so that's kind of part of their survival strategy. So you tarp them, they're in the dark, but they don't really care because they're not trying to do anything anyway. Whereas that's why this time of year is great. So in the wintertime, it can take like 3 or 4 months to really break down a crop of weeds underneath the tarp. This time of year, everything's trying to grow. It's all trying to photosynthesize. It's all trying to use up those starch reserves and grow tops and make the plant, beat the rest of the plants to seed and so on. And so this is a great time to kill weeds with tarps. So that was a sort of a complicated answer, but that is the truth. And Burnett asks about seeds that I do not recommend starting indoors. The champion of that category would be carrots. I think that's ridiculous. I know people do it, but it doesn't make sense to me. And the people who do it still have not the best results. I think that generally that's not the thing to use. And it's because they're so small. Well, that's not really the problem. The problem is they taproot out so quickly. So when you plant a carrot, it starts sending out roots before it ever sends up leaves. And that root is mostly a long, tiny, tiny little taproot. And that taproot finds its way down, and that's what's going to become your carrot. Well, if you don't get those plants, if they don't get those carrots transplanted out in a hurry, and by a hurry, I mean the people who I know who are doing it before the leaves even appear, then you really are, you're going to get messed up roots because they're going to split, they're going to get wonky and weird. And so I think that's one of those that it really pays to just use your most weed-free soil and pay close attention to them and direct seed them. But otherwise, no, I have not it's not a lot of other plants I haven't tried to transplant, and there's not a lot of other plants that I can think of that I wouldn't, can't see a scenario where it'd be a good idea to transplant them. Carrots are the only real one. This is what I was saying about saving time, so you can hang out on your tractor. But the reason that I think seeding in a transplant situation can save time is that it's one of those things where you can do that on a rainy, nasty January, February, March, even April day in a greenhouse, and you just can't do anything out in the field. So sometimes you have to do what you can when you can, and so using those plants that way makes a lot of sense. I mean, using those seedlings kind of in that way is like, I can keep working by growing seedlings, and then when the time comes, I can move those out into the field real quickly and be ahead of be on my schedule or ahead of schedule. Okay, so when do we grow them? Speaking of ahead of schedule. So we're going to talk a little bit about planning, scheduling, and then following the plan. Here's a pretty decent shot of our spreadsheet. This has a few columns missing because I can't fit all the columns into a screenshot, but it starts over here with the type of vegetable. So, and I have it sorted right here by type of vegetable, which is why these are all arugula. But this is an interesting way to view it because it does tell you that this is how many successions of arugula we're going to put in this season. Quite a bit of arugula. We're using the variety rocket. That's not really true, actually, but that's what's on the spreadsheet for now. It's going to be 250 row feet, but that's going to be done in 5 rows in a bed. So it's really half of a bed. Okay, so we've got, I hope this is big enough for everybody else to see. I think it's probably pretty good size. 250 row feet translates into 5 rows of 50 feet. And I'm going to put 5 rows on a bed, so that means that this is half of a bed for me. So a 3-foot wide, 100-foot long bed. I'm going to do half of a bed of arugula, and I'm doing that basically every 2 weeks. As you look down here at my dates to seed, and that's because I want to be able to harvest a half bed of arugula basically every 2 weeks. And that's the other thing that's in this schedule here. Everything keys off of harvest date. Let's see, I've got a question, I think. Let's see. Good. Can see the details. Excellent. I am glad to share this too, and I've told people that before, but I mean it. I'm glad to share. I've got an easy to access Google Documents copy of it that will gladly send to you, or send you a link to it. So if that's something you're interested in, you're welcome to it. I'll warn you up front. It's big. It's unwieldy. It makes us pull out our hair at least twice a year. But it's a handy tool too. But I started to say, so all the dates key off of this harvest date, because this is what really matters. As a market farmer, this is really where I'm looking. When am I going to harvest the first arugula? When's the next arugula going to come? When's the next arugula going to come? I'm always looking for that harvest date. But the problem with all of us is we tend to be more focused on the end result than on the process of getting there. And so we have to have this plan that kind of translates that back in time that says, hey, remember, you want to harvest arugula on the 1st of April. You need to make sure you get a bed of arugula planted around the 7th of March. And that's what this plan does. Okay, so now this is direct seeded, but my transplant plan works exactly the same way, which is what we're going to look at next. It's all in the same document, but that one was sorted by variety. So all the arugula is transplanted or direct seeded right now. Swiss chart. Well, let's skip down to the tomatoes. That's more interesting. So we got tomatoes here. I'm sorry that cut off the edge. I'm not sure why. But we got, these are just regular tomatoes, and these are cherry tomatoes. And we got some paste tomatoes. This is where they're going to go. This is their type. So they're either determinates or indeterminates. And this is their actual variety, right? So this gives you an idea of the varieties of tomatoes we're growing. Again, how many row feet? What's their spacing going to be? We put out all our tomatoes on 12-inch spacing these days. That's pretty crowded for most recommendations, but we find that it works fairly well. How many plants are we going to need? How many does that mean we want to seed? So here's an interesting number. So we're going to, if we want 100 tomato plants, in general, we think we probably need to seed more like 120. If we really need 100 to go out in the field, we probably better plan on seeding 120. And that extra 20%, if they all seed, great. We have an extra 20 plants. We can sell them, give them away, compost them, whatever needs to happen. But if we come up short, then we're going to short our beds, which means we're now going to be short on production all summer long. So that's a bad deal. So we always want to have a few more plants than we need, which also feeds, herb sales. So, I mean, plant sales. So that's not bad. And then over here, we've got, this is where this plant is going to diverge from what we saw in the arugula. That is, we've got the date to seed. When do we want to seed it? This 35 here is the days to maturity. And this is then the transplant date. So we're going to have the plants in the greenhouse for 35 days. That's 5 weeks, right? And then we're going to transplant them out. Now these are going out pretty young. They're going out as little plants, so that's why they're going out so fast. Some of these others that you see down here have a 65 days to maturity because we're potting them up once, making them into much bigger plants. And it's in a cooler greenhouse. They're growing a little slower. So these real early tomatoes. But these late tomatoes, they're going to grow pretty fast, and we're going to set them out as little babies. And then they're going to have about, somewhere around 80 days to maturity. And so we're going to start harvesting these around the 3rd of August. And so this is why this matters, again, with planting and seedling and so on, because we want to know that starting in the 30th of May, and really it's been, for the last several seasons, it's been a little sooner than this, but we count on it by the 30th of May, we're going to have some tomatoes coming in. What we've noticed is if we don't have some other tomatoes in successions, then we will not have tomatoes by the 1st of August. And so that's why we've timed this other succession to kick in the 1st of August. And there's actually a 3rd succession in here that's not represented on this plan. This is a dated plan. Well, it says it is 2019. Anyway, we've got a 3rd succession in here now. And that goes in between these two. So we have some that start around the middle of July, because that's when we start to notice our things can drop off. Let's see, I have a question here. How do you determine planting group or where to plant them? That's a great question. Burnett, that's a whole nother session. In short, I'll say we'll look at the needs of the plants and we try and group them by their needs. That's the short way to say it. So they have similar temperature needs, they have similar weed control problems, they have similar pest problems. We will try and group those things together so that we can manage them as a group. So it's a little counterintuitive. We're not trying to spread out things that have the same pest problems all over the farm, because in our experience, that really doesn't work on a farm of our scale. We're just too small for that to be an effective strategy. So instead, it's better for us to group them together and manage them as a group. One of the things I love about our spreadsheet is it's portable, because we can print it out. We can sort it for the purpose that we need. So this is the greenhouse version. And so this is sorted by seeding date. So right over here, date to seed, that you can see. So this is this week's project, right? So you can see this week we had a bunch of seeding to do. Some of it got a little behind, 6 days behind schedule. That's not a big deal. And some of it got in just a little bit early too, probably down here at the far end. So we jot down when we actually seeded it. But this lives in the greenhouse, and this is our paper version. And its function is to just keep us on track. We find that if we get the seeds in the ground in the transplants at the right time, then when the transplants get to the right size, we have them to transplant. It's not rocket science, it's just good planning. But it is important to carry it out, and the best way to carry it out is to have a version that is easy to find and easy to read. So that's what we do. We print it out for this purpose down here at the farm stand. I mean at the seeding area. Speaking of seeding area, so we've got this table, just a plywood top. This is our main seeding space. A lot of, hundreds of thousands of seeds go through here in a year. Behind us, we've got some shelving. We've got some soil amendments there, and we've got trays. I don't think I actually have a shot underneath this, but there's trays stacked underneath here, so we can pull. We have easy access to trays. And then we also have bigger pots and things like that we're going to use as we pot up. This is a really important little flower pot here. This is where we keep our marking supplies. So we have tags. We use mostly for our plant tags, we use old Venetian blinds. My father's a landlord. He's always taken Venetian blinds out of places. So he brings us Venetian blinds, and we chop them up into little plant tags. They're great as long as you remember to get them out of the field before they get overgrown and tilled under. But they're little easy to use pieces of plastic that write on real easily. And we have found that the best thing to write on them with is a China marker. Sharpies fade. Pencil's pretty good, but it's not dark enough. Maybe like a softer pencil might work good, but the typical pencil doesn't work that well. And any other type of marker we just haven't had any success with. So, but the China marker is really it's a really soft crayon, and it works really well. Storage is important. When you go to go get this, you're reading your seed plan, you need to be able to go and pick the seeds off the shelf easily. We store our categories in buckets. So we've got Asian greens here, we've got broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kale, we've got celery and celeriac, we've got lettuces, and so on. So these are kept in a dark, cool space. Currently, we're keeping them in our tomato room, which we keep at this time of year. It lingers around 50 degrees, and it's dark. Oops, forgot to turn that one. This is a list of where we want to germinate things. And so as we talk about how, one of the big important things is what temperature are we going to use for germination? Different seeds want different temperatures. That's pretty straightforward. We could guess that based on their growing conditions. But here's how we think of that on a real practical scale, especially when we're talking to interns and apprentices, is here's a list of things that we never want to put in our germination chamber. Our germination chamber is kept about 75 or 80. We never want to put celery, spinach, or celeriac. Now, actually, celery and celeriac don't mind being in the germination chamber, but they take forever. So we don't put them in there because it doesn't speed them up that much. They just waste the space. But spinach does not do well in the germination chamber. We don't want to raise spinach germination temperature to 80 degrees. We won't get spinach. Things that only go in the germination chamber from January to April. So this is because the greenhouse is going to be cool during that time period, and so we do want to put things in the germination chamber to get them to warm up and pop a little quicker, start germinating a little quicker. But later in the season, it's going to be too hot out in the germination chamber because it does get heated up, and so we want to put these out in the greenhouse where they'll be warm enough, but hopefully not too hot. And then over here, these are things that always must go in the germination chamber all the time, and so these guys always appreciate the heat and the high humidity that's in the germination chamber. And this is our germination chamber. Oh, where'd I go? Okay, we'll come back to the germination chamber. It's in this next section. Media is a big part of this, right? If we're going to start a bunch of seedlings, we're going to need some potting soil. We used to make our own using city compost and peat and gypsum, a whole list of things. And we did that based on Elliot Coleman's recipe. And then after a while, we gave that up because what we found was if you left out any one ingredient, by accident or because, you got called away to do something else and then you came back and you go, now where was I in mixing that thing up? It's very much like making a cake recipe. If you leave something out, you will notice later. So we went to a bagged mix. And we've done this. We've done Happy Frog. Happy Frog is too expensive on our scale. It's a great, if you're looking for a mix you can buy by the bag, I don't think you can do any better than Happy Frog. It's a fantastic mix. Berger is a much more economical mix for us. It's pretty basic. It's basically a peat and perlite mix. Can't say that I'm a huge fan other than it's cheap and easy to use. And we do usually add nutrients to this one because we don't think it has enough. Certainly not for like a tomato that's going to be in the pot for 6 or 8 weeks at least, maybe even 12 weeks. They just don't have enough fertilizer in there for us. But we're, the nice thing about the Berger is we can afford to buy it by the pallet. And so when we are growing big gallon pots of tomatoes or even, bigger containers like those herb containers you saw earlier, and I want to put a foot of potting soil on top of that, then I can do that with these bags of cheap potting soil. And I can add my custom fertilizer mix to those. And then, then I'm doing it in a kind of a batch time. And I know that I can make sure I get the right things in there. This is what we're currently using, and we really like this. It's from Morgan Composting. It's called Dairy Dew. We teamed up with a bunch of other farmers to buy some down from Wisconsin this year, and we're very happy with it. It's a beautiful soil, great potting mix, has great mycorrhizal action. It's got everything we would want to see in a potting soil, and so we're very pleased with that. Dairy Dew from Morgan Composting. Containers come in all shapes and sizes. Some of our seedlings we grow in the greenhouse in beds. So sometimes the container is the soil, but it's not the permanent location of the plant. So we're going to move these, in this case, leeks out. And and move them to the out into the field. Soil blocking is one of our favorites. Little 3-inch pots. We do quite a few of these. When we pot tomatoes up, this is usually what we will move them to. Soil blocking. Oh, trays. I'm sorry. Go back to that. I do not like trays. Never been a big fan of cell trays. I can't keep them well watered. These are a little bit better. Wind strip trays still have problems with watering. But again, soil blocking is my favorite. And so this is a video. Again, I don't think it'll play very well. So what I'll do is I'll kind of use it as a slideshow. But we have a sloppy mix of potting soil here. It's really wet. People often describe the texture of proper potting soil, of proper soil blocking soil, as something around wet oatmeal, and that's a pretty good description. So I'm going to make a kind of mound out of it, and then I'm going to use my soil block mold to press into that mound, and that's going to pick some of the soil up, and then I'm going to press it out in blocks on my into my seedling tray. So let's see here if I can get us to the point where we're going to see that. Okay, there I am with that is the soil block maker. This is a big one. It's a stand-up model. It's a 20, let's see, what is that, a 35 block maker. It's a fairly small block. I think it's 1.25 inches, maybe 1.5 inches. So it's a small little growing cell, but it's still a lot more soil than even like a 48 or 50 in terms of, well, that's not true. It's more than a 75, which would be kind of what it's comparable to in terms of cell trays. I really like this size block. We use most of our kale, broccoli, lettuces, things like that all get blocked in this when we're blocking. And then we have we got bigger blockers too. We've got 2-inch blocks. We've got some we've actually got a monster blocker that I really never got into using that makes a 4-inch block, and Elliott Coleman still uses those for large cucurbit transplants. We just try and get our cucurbits out in the ground sooner than that, and I think that works okay for us. But you know, to each his own. So there is the soil blocker filled. So we got a smooth bottom. It's all packed up in there, and now we're going to put it into the tray, which is going to be a matter of setting it down into the tray like that. And then I'm going to depress the plunger. So the plunger's right here, and it's going to push those blocks out. And there's the finished product. So we're making, like I said, you know, fairly small blocks. You get with this one, you get 108 in a tray. So that's a pretty good size. That's a lot of plants in a tray, but because they fill the whole space, they don't have a lot of plastic between them. They have a lot of soil, and so they have some pretty good resilience. That's one of the things we love about soil blocking, is that they really are very forgiving in terms of when you need to plant them out. Whereas cell trays, you have a pretty narrow window before they get really root bound. Soil blocks have a lot more soil in there, and that is forgiving that way. You know, this is, now that you know what this area is for, it makes a little more sense maybe, but there's this dog glue bottom, it turns out, this round plastic piece, that's where we make our soil blocks. And this is the end result, right? So, you know, good soil blocks grow out, and then we pot them up, and then we'll add, we'll use that potting soil mix to pot them up into larger pots. Now, not all of ours get potted into this size. This is really a pretty large plant. Usually we would grow, for transplanting on our own farm, we would mostly grow them in 3-inch pots after soil blocking. But sometimes we'll grow them in this and transplant them out. More often we'll grow them like this and sell them. And there you can kind of see both stages. You've got these early little guys starting here, but then you've got these, got the larger potted up plants out there. Germination chamber, we talked a little bit about this, but the germination chamber keeps us at around 80 degrees is what I'm aiming for. So I've got a really expensive thermostat and a really cheap little heater. So this is that tiny little heater down on the bottom, and it's plugged into that fancy schmancy thermostat. And this is just a thermometer for me to check the accuracy of my thermostat. My thermostat is extremely inaccurate, but it's very precise. So to keep it in a real narrow range, it's just not, I don't use the actual temperature dial on there. I pay attention to what my thermometer says. But the thermometer, the thermostat's important because I don't want to overheat or underheat these seedlings. And this heater does that job just fine. You can also see I've got a couple pans of water in here, and that's to keep the humidity up. Not usually a problem, because usually if we're using it, if we have a full germination chamber, we're going to have plenty of moisture in there coming off all the soil. And here's my list. I don't know how this slide ended up here, but for example, spinach won't germinate above 80, lettuce goes dormant above 90, tomatoes, most solanaceous crops, want 75, rarely germinate below 50, and some seeds want a stratification period. Lisianthus, pawpaw, larkspur, there's several of those that want to be cool and wet for a long time. And so we have different ways of meeting those needs. We have the germination chamber, but we also have coolers, right? We have cooler 1, cooler 2, or cooler 3, all kept at slightly different temperatures and humidities for the produce purpose, but we can put seedlings in here as well to make sure they germinate. And we'll use that, especially in the summertime when it gets really too hot for lettuces and spinach. We will grow them in cooler 3, which we keep at about 55. That's a great place to get them started. Now, of course, once they pop, we don't have lights in there, so we immediately need to move them out. But that's fine. All we really need them to do is just germinate, and then we can move them outside. Yeah, I already showed you this list. This is the always and seasonally and never in the germination chamber. And just examples of different ways different places we'll put seedlings at different times. And we do have a thermometer, so we check soil temps. We try and pay attention to what's going on. Observation, modification, and then checking back in. These are the ways that we learn from our growing. Speaking of learning from my growing, automated water, super important. For the first couple of years we grew, well, actually we adopted this fairly early. It might have been our first year even, second year, I mean. But the first year we didn't, and there were several times I killed seedlings just by lack of attention. There's a lot going on the farm, especially this time of year, and the temperatures fluctuate so much that one day you don't need to water hardly at all, and the next day you need to water twice a day, and it's hard to have a mentality that's that flexible. We tend to be creatures of habit. So I water the greenhouse every day. That's how I think of it in the summertime. I water the greenhouse every third day. That's how I think of it in the wintertime. Spring and fall can be really tricky. So automated water saves our bacon. We set our automation so that it provides about 90% of the water that we need on an average day. So what is an average day? Probably a 70 degree with partly sunny. And then that means that, so sometimes we get a little more water than we want on cold, rainy days. Sometimes I'll turn it off if it stays cold and rainy for a couple days. But then if it gets too hot, I absolutely have to use my water wand on it because otherwise I will dry things out and kill them. But these are sprinklers, kind of a mist type sprinkler, and they're set up on a timer. And so that's a really simple way to increase the health of your plants. There's a good shot of the little sprinklers. Not my favorite sprinklers. I had some better sprinklers that I liked better. They stopped making them, of course, and my old ones finally wore out. They kind of, our water's hard enough that eventually they kind of start to get crusty and don't work as well. Lots and lots and lots of tomato plants. There's my timer. Yeah, real simple. And then, of course, we still have a lot of stuff we hand water. We have not gotten away from that. I think, it's not a great use of time to be hand watering, but the truth is sometimes it's the best you can do because depending on where you've set things or where you've planted things, they may or may not have access to automated water. And also, based on what we just talked about, sometimes things need more or less water, and that fluctuates really extremely and seasonally. So you can't really just plan on always giving them the exact same amount of water and ignoring them. That doesn't really work, especially for things that are not in the ground. Things are in the ground, it's a little different. You can get away with some of that, but things that are in containers, that just doesn't work. Heat, they want heat, right? And so one way we do that is with a soil heating table. It's got a thermostat, that's what that is. It's got an on-demand water heater that warms the water up. It's got a pump that circulates the water, and it circulates the water through these manifolds, which are mounted in the middle of my seedling table. And then all this tubing, these black lines are little black spaghetti tubing. And so the hot water is going down, all the way down to the end of the table, turning the corner and coming back to that manifold, and then back to the water heater. This is a really simple and very effective method of heating the soil of the plants. And we found to have really, really good results with bottom heat. We just love bottom heat. It's a super effective way to grow plants, as opposed to like heating the air all the time. The air is, you're really trying to warm their toes, not their tops, right? Warming their tops too much will just cause plants to stretch out and get gangly. Warming their toes will cause them to be nice, strong root systems with fairly stocky, strong tops. That's what we're after. Speaking of strong tops, another big part of this is moving the air around, and so this is a big part of keeping the air moving is having circulation fans. And you want enough circulation that the plants do move just a little bit in the breeze. That'll strengthen them up, cause them to be stronger, thicker stemmed, and that means when you move them outside, there's less chance of them being broken. Speaking of moving plants outside, this used to be our system. And, I think that I don't have, maybe I may have the next shot. I hope I have that in here. Anyway, this was our system. This was all we had for hardening off. We could roll things like right to this door and kind of let them hang out there. We now have a big concrete slab out here, and it's a wonderful thing. I know concrete is kind of scary and permanent and expensive, but boy, is it handy when you want to roll things. And so we have a concrete pad out here that we can roll these what we call hardening off racks. So we'll put plants that are going to go out sometime in the next couple of weeks. We'll start moving them outside for the day. We'll move them back in if it's going to be a cold night, like if we're going to have frost. But we'll move them in and out, multiple times. But putting them on a rack like this makes it so much easier to do that. And what we're doing is we're toughening the plants up. We're causing them to grow a little slower, firm up their stems and leaves so they don't snap in the wind, that sort of thing. Yeah, I didn't have a better picture of that hardening off slab, but this slab's been a really nice feature for us. We really enjoy being able to, it's big enough that we can do lots of things on it, including hardening plants off, but also we use it for growing space in the summertime because it gets too hot in the greenhouse for some stuff to grow. So we can it's a nice concrete slab we clean off the slab and then we'll lay out all our lettuce transplants out there and that kind of thing. And we can just water them directly on the slab, and that works really well. So when we put transplants out in the ground, I'm getting down to the end of this here, I hope, but transplants out in the ground, there's a lot of different ways to do that. We can put them in landscape fabric, which we're burning holes in landscape fabric there. We can, there we go. We can put them into compost. These are freshly composted beds. I love doing that. It's always a nice way to do it. Question is, oh yeah, good. Okay, so Patrick is reminding everybody, if you have to leave, please follow this link in the chat. Patrick, it doesn't look like that's a clickable link. I don't know if you can change that or not, but
it actually is a clickable
anyway,
link.
Please share a survey with us. We want to know how this works for you guys. Frankly, we're thinking this might be, next month too. So we're hoping that we can fine tune this and make it even better. So on transplanting, one of the things that I really love to do is get things in the right places. And this is a really simple tool for doing that. We call it a spacing frame. Really small bits of hardwood here, long thin strips screwed together on a 6-inch spacing. And then we've got a line every 6 inches. So what we've got is a 6x6 grid to lay over the bed. And then we can use whichever parts of that grid we want, right? So we can put something on 6-inch and 6-inch spacing, or we can go every other one and do a foot spacing, and we can do 2 rows or 3 rows or 5 rows, whatever we want to do on the bed. But it's a super simple tool that will keep your rows straight. If you get nothing else out of this tonight, if you send me a picture of your straight rows later because you built a spacing frame, I will consider this whole thing a success. Because my little OCD heart loves to see straight lines of plants. Isn't that satisfying? You can't do that by hand. At least I can't do that by hand. I wander. So the frame really helps keep us straight. And the point of this too is, this is part of the advantage of transplanting is you give every plant the space it needs to thrive and reach its maximum size. If you give them less space than that, they will not grow to full size. If you give them more space than that, then you're wasting your soil. So give them the right amount of space. All right, and that is the end of this presentation. We have any questions?